The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the sprawling expanse of our military camp. It was a sight I had only imagined in my dreams, rows of tanks and trucks lined up in meticulous formation, their surfaces gleaming under the late afternoon sun. I remember thinking that it was almost too beautiful, like some grand spectacle orchestrated just for us. But then, reality tugged me back. This wasn't a show, it was the beginning of something far graver. I stood there, my boots digging into the dust of the campgrounds, feeling a mixture of pride and jittery anticipation. The camp buzzed with activity. Everywhere I looked, soldiers scurried about, their voices blending into a symphony of hurried preparation. There were the low hums of trucks being inspected, the clatter of metal as weapons were checked, and the sharp commands of officers cutting through the air like blades. I was 19, barely out of my teens, and yet here I was, on the brink of a monumental campaign, Operation Barbarossa. The grandeur of it all was almost overwhelming. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for us to make our move. As the evening deepened, the sky turned from a fiery orange to a dusky blue, speckled with the first shy stars. The camp was transformed by the twilight. The harsh lines of the day softened into shadows. I found myself sitting around a campfire with a small group of comrades. The firelight flickered on our faces, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the restless energy we all felt. "Can you believe it?" one of my comrades asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but brimming with excitement. "Tomorrow, we're marching into the Soviet Union. We're part of something historic." I nodded, unable to hide the fervor in my eyes. Yes, it's finally happening. All those drills and preparations, they were for this moment. We're going to make history. My voice was shaky, but the enthusiasm was genuine. We were about to embark on a mission that would reshape the war, and I felt a fierce pride in being a part of it. The fire crackled and popped, sending up occasional sparks that danced in the air before fading away. Our conversations flowed from one topic to another, each one tinged with a mix of bravado and unease. We talked about the Soviet forces, their supposed weaknesses, and the glory that awaited us. But beneath the bravado, there was an undercurrent of nervousness and unspoken acknowledgement that this was no mere training exercise. "I heard they're expecting us," another soldier said, his face illuminated by the fire's glow. "The Soviets are bracing for a fight. They know we're coming." We all laughed, but the sound was hollow, almost forced. It was a way of masking the anxiety we all felt, but dared not voice. The reality of what lay ahead was beginning to sink in, but we pushed it aside, focusing instead on the excitement of the unknown. As the evening wore on, I found myself wandering away from the campfire, my thoughts a swirl of anticipation and uncertainty. I walked through the rows of parked vehicles and weapons, their shadows stretching long and eerie in the fading light. Each piece of machinery, each vehicle, seemed to hum with a life of its own, a silent testament to the massive operation that was about to unfold. I paused near a line of tanks, their metal surfaces cold and unyielding against my touch. The clamor of the camp seemed distant now, replaced by a profound silence that was almost reverent. I imagined the coming battle, the vast expanses of the Soviet Union, and the role I would play in this grand scheme. It was both exhilarating and daunting. The night grew darker, and the camp slowly quieted down as soldiers sought rest before the big day. I returned to my quarters, the weight of the impending invasion heavy on my shoulders. As I lay on my bunk, staring up at the ceiling, my thoughts raced. The excitement that had buoyed me throughout the day was tempered by a gnawing sense of foreboding. Tomorrow would be the start of something colossal, and I was about to step into the heart of it. I closed my eyes, trying to push away the growing anxiety. This was what I had trained for, what I had dreamed of. We were on the brink of something historic, and there was no turning back. As I drifted into a restless sleep, I could only hope that the reality of what lay ahead would somehow live up to the grand expectations I had built up in my mind. The camp, once a hive of nervous energy, had transformed into a scene of organized chaos. Soldiers bustled with grim efficiency, their movements precise and deliberate. Our columns of tanks and trucks began to roll out, each rumble of the engines a low, insistent growl that seemed to shake the earth itself. The air was charged with an electric sense of purpose. Every breath I took tinged with the biting chill of early summer in Eastern Europe. I marched alongside my comrades, the rhythmic clunk of our boots against the dirt road forming a steady beat that accompanied our advance. The landscape was a tapestry of green and brown, fields of crops and patches of forest giving way to the sprawling Russian plains. The sheer scale of our operation was staggering, a moving sea of steel and men stretching out in every direction. The morning air was sharp, the sky a pale blue canvas gradually warming under the rising sun. As the miles slipped away beneath our boots, the terrain shifted subtly but noticeably. The rolling hills of Central Europe gave way to flatter, more open expanses. The roads were lined with makeshift signs and arrows directing our columns, each one marking another step closer to the heart of the Soviet Union. "Look at this," one of my fellow soldiers shouted over the rumble of the engines, gesturing towards the endless line of vehicles. "We're part of the largest invasion force in history." I glanced at the seemingly endless convoy of tanks and trucks, each one a testament to the scale of our mission. There were hundreds of thousands of us, and the sight was both awe-inspiring and a little overwhelming. The enormity of it all began to settle in, a sobering reminder of the gravity of our task. The journey eastward was not without its share of hardships. The roads were rough, their surfaces cracked and uneven from years of use. Dust billowed around us, swirling in the wake of the passing vehicles, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. Every so often, the convoy would slow to a crawl as we navigated around obstacles or made repairs. The air was filled with the acrid smell of diesel and the occasional clang of metal tools. Our supply trucks, laden with equipment and provisions, moved with a laborious steadiness, each one an essential cog in the machine of war. We passed through small villages, their residents peering out with wary curiosity. They watched us with a mixture of apprehension and resignation, their lives about to be dramatically altered by the vast force sweeping through their land. "Keep your eyes open," our commanding officer reminded us, his voice carrying a note of stern authority. "We're entering unfamiliar territory. Expect resistance and be ready for anything." The further we advanced, the more the landscape seemed to stretch out before us in an endless expanse. The flat, open terrain of the Eastern Front was stark and imposing, a stark contrast to the rolling hills and dense forests of home. It felt like we were marching towards the edge of the world, and every mile seemed to carry a sense of foreboding. As the day wore on, the initial excitement of the march gave way to a more contemplative mood. The reality of our mission began to sink in as the sun climbed higher in the sky, its rays casting long shadows across the vast, open fields. The enormity of the operation was becoming increasingly apparent, and with it came a growing awareness of the challenges that lay ahead. By midday, the convoy had covered a significant distance, the unrelenting march punctuated by brief stops for rest and refueling. We gathered in small groups, huddling around field kitchens for hastily prepared meals. The food was simple but nourishing, and there was a brief respite from the relentless advance. Conversations during these breaks were a mix of banter and apprehensive speculation about the days to come. "Do you think they're ready for us?" one soldier asked, his voice tinged with a hint of doubt. "The Soviets, I mean. They've had time to prepare." "We're ready," another replied confidently. "We've been training for this. We'll smash through their defenses." The camaraderie of these brief exchanges was a welcome distraction from the harsh realities of the march. It was a fleeting moment of normalcy amidst the grand spectacle of war, a reminder of the bond that held us together as we marched into the unknown. As evening approached, the air grew cooler, and the landscape began to take on a more somber hue. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows over the endless plains. The vast expanse of our operation seemed almost to stretch into infinity, a relentless advance that promised no respite. We camped for the night in a makeshift encampment, our tents forming neat rows against the backdrop of the encroaching twilight. The sounds of the day gradually faded, replaced by the more subdued noises of the night, distant murmurs of conversation, the crackle of campfires, and the occasional gust of wind rustling through the fields. As I lay in my tent, staring up at the darkening sky, I couldn't shake the sense of awe and trepidation that had settled over me. We were on the cusp of something monumental, and the weight of it pressed heavily on my shoulders. The march eastward was just the beginning, and the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty and peril. With the distant hum of engines and the soft murmur of voices as my lullaby, I drifted into a restless sleep, the dreams of glory and valor mingling with the stark reality of the task before us. Tomorrow, we would press further into the heart of the Soviet Union, and the true test of Operation Barbarossa would begin. The convoy had halted at the edge of a small, rural settlement, its ragged outline barely discernible in the early morning light. We had been advancing through a series of villages and scattered homesteads, each one seemingly more desolate than the last. The scenery was an unending panorama of empty fields and scattered trees, the occasional dilapidated structure a stark reminder of the region's isolation. As we approached the settlement, the once familiar buzz of activity gave way to an eerie stillness. The usual pre-battle preparations were underway, but there was an undercurrent of unease that pervaded the camp. The soldiers moved with an almost reverent caution, their faces set in grim determination. It was clear that the time for grand gestures and theoretical discussions was over. The reality of combat was imminent. Our battalion was assigned to secure the outskirts of the village and push forward into the heart of the Soviet defenses. The initial movements were methodical, each step carefully calculated as we advanced. The infantry moved in tight formations, their rifles at the ready, while the tanks and armored vehicles trundled behind, their engines a low, throaty growl that resonated across the flat terrain. "Stay sharp," our commanding officer's voice crackled over the radio. "We're expecting resistance. This isn't going to be a walk in the park." The first hint of opposition came as a distant rumble, a faint vibration that traveled up through the ground like a premonition. I could feel my heartbeat quicken as the soldiers around me exchanged uneasy glances. The silence of the morning was shattered by the sudden, jarring sound of gunfire. It was as if the very air had been punctured by the sharp, staccato reports of rifles and the deeper, more menacing blasts of artillery. We moved into position, taking cover behind the remains of what had once been a small farmhouse. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes, the windows shattered and empty. I crouched behind a makeshift barricade of wooden planks and debris, my heart pounding in my chest. The once innocuous village was now a battlefield, and every corner seemed to hold hidden dangers. The skirmish unfolded with a brutal immediacy. Soviet troops, concealed within the rubble of the village, opened fire with surprising accuracy. The crackle of their machine guns mingled with the stuttering bursts of our own weapons, creating a cacophony of sound that filled the air. The chaos was almost surreal, a nightmarish blur of movement and noise that left me disoriented. "Incoming!" a comrade shouted, pointing towards a plume of smoke rising from a nearby building. The warning came too late. The explosion rocked the ground beneath us, sending a shower of debris and dust into the air. I flinched instinctively, covering my head with my arms as the world seemed to erupt around me. We returned fire with determined ferocity, our rifles and machine guns blazing in response to the Soviet resistance. The ground was littered with spent shells and the wreckage of vehicles, the air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning fuel. Every shot seemed to echo endlessly, a relentless reminder of the violence that had been unleashed. Amidst the turmoil, I found myself paired with a fellow soldier, our positions shifting as we advanced through the ruins of the village. We moved in short, calculated bursts, seeking cover behind the skeletal remains of buildings and vehicles. The landscape was a jigsaw of shattered masonry and twisted metal, each corner presenting a new threat. The battle was a test of endurance and resolve. Every inch gained seemed to come at a heavy cost, with casualties mounting on both sides. The intensity of the skirmish was staggering, a visceral reminder of the brutality that lay at the heart of war. I could hear the anguished cries of wounded men, the sobering reality of the violence we were inflicting and enduring. Despite the chaos, there were moments of eerie calm. Between the bursts of gunfire, there were fleeting glimpses of the village's former life, a child's broken toy lying in the dirt, a half-burnt photograph fluttering in the wind. These remnants of a peaceful existence served as a stark contrast to the violence erupting around them, a haunting reminder of what was being destroyed. As the day wore on, the skirmish began to wind down, the resistance fading as the Soviet troops were pushed back. The once active village lay in eerie silence, the echoes of battle lingering in the air. The ground was littered with the detritus of combat, and the smoke of the battle hung heavy, a grim shroud over the ruined landscape. We regrouped, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as we surveyed the aftermath. The victory was ours, but it was a hollow one, marred by the heavy toll of the day's fighting. The village was a shattered shell of its former self, its buildings reduced to rubble, and its streets strewn with debris. The cost of our advance was evident in the faces of our fellow soldiers, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and grim resignation. As I sat down amidst the wreckage, my mind raced with a mix of emotions: relief, horror, and a profound sense of disillusionment. The skirmish had been brutal, a stark reminder of the harsh reality of war. The initial excitement of our march had given way to a sobering awareness of the true nature of our mission. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the devastated village. The day's light gave way to the somber twilight, the sky a canvas of deepening blues and purples. I lay down on the cold ground, the weight of the day's events settling heavily on my shoulders. The first skirmish of Operation Barbarossa was over, but the path ahead promised only more of the same. As the camp began to settle into the evening routine, the sounds of battle were replaced by the softer murmur of voices and the occasional crackle of a campfire. The reality of our situation was beginning to sink in, and with it came a sense of grim acceptance. The war was far from over, and the days ahead would demand more of us than we had ever imagined. I closed my eyes, the events of the day replaying in my mind. The skirmish had been a brutal awakening, a stark introduction to the harsh realities of the Eastern Front. The village lay in ruins, and as I drifted off to sleep, I could only hope that the trials ahead would bring us closer to victory, even as they exacted a heavy toll on all of us. The morning of the major offensive dawned with a foreboding clarity, the sky a cold expanse of steel-gray clouds that seemed to press down upon us. The atmosphere was taut with expectation, each breath I took hanging heavy with the weight of impending action. Our battalion had been repositioned to the edge of a large Soviet stronghold, a heavily fortified position that loomed ahead like a dark specter against the horizon. As the first light of day seeped through the overcast sky, the camp sprang to life with a renewed sense of urgency. The sounds of preparation were a chaotic symphony, artillery being rolled into place, tanks rumbling forward, and the sharp commands of officers cutting through the morning air. The energy was palpable, an electric tension that set my nerves on edge. I stood among my comrades, our faces etched with grim determination, as we waited for the signal to advance. The weight of our gear was a tangible burden, every piece of equipment a reminder of the task at hand. Our rifles were checked and rechecked, and the roar of engines filled the air, drowning out any semblance of quiet. The offensive began with a thunderous roar. The first wave of artillery shells screamed overhead, their arcs of fire painting the sky with streaks of fire and smoke. The explosions shook the ground beneath us, their impacts sending shockwaves that rattled our very bones. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of destruction that seemed to swallow everything else. "Here we go," a fellow soldier shouted, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. "Stay low and keep moving." We surged forward as the artillery bombardment continued, the ground shaking beneath our feet. The tanks rolled in front of us, their massive treads churning up the earth as they plowed through the battlefield. The air was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the faint, metallic scent of blood. The Soviet stronghold, a sprawling complex of bunkers and trenches, came into view. It was a formidable fortification, its defenses a complex network of barriers and obstacles. The initial assault had softened their defenses, but the real challenge lay ahead. We were tasked with breaching the outer fortifications and pushing deep into the heart of the stronghold. The moment we hit the first line of trenches, the battle became an intense melee. The Soviet defenders, dug in and determined, met us with fierce resistance. Machine guns chattered from hidden positions, their rapid bursts mingling with the sharp cracks of rifle fire. Each step forward was a hard-fought victory, the terrain littered with the debris of conflict. Push through. Don't stop, came the roar of our sergeant as we engaged in close-quarters combat. His voice cut through the chaos, a beacon of command amidst the bedlam. The trench lines were narrow and winding, the space barely wide enough for a single soldier to move. It felt like fighting within a labyrinth, every corner potentially hiding an enemy or a trap. I fought with a relentless focus, the world narrowing to the immediate space around me. The firefight was a blur of motion and noise, each moment a visceral clash of steel and flesh. The Soviet defenders fought with a desperate tenacity, their faces etched with determination as they strove to hold their ground. Despite their resistance, we pressed on, inching forward through the maze of trenches and bunkers. The sky was now a roiling mass of smoke and dust, the once clear daylight obscured by the haze of battle. The sounds of combat were a relentless barrage of explosions, gunfire, and the cries of wounded men blending into a disorienting symphony. Our advance was not without cost. Casualties mounted as the battle raged on, the toll of war evident in the fallen soldiers and the wounded being carried back from the front lines. The sight of our comrades falling was a grim reminder of the price we were paying for each step gained. It was a sobering contrast to the initial enthusiasm of our march, the reality of combat now all too clear. As the day wore on, the offensive began to shift. We reached the inner fortifications, the heavily fortified core of the Soviet stronghold. The battle became even more intense, the enemy's defenses proving to be a formidable obstacle. The fortified positions were heavily reinforced, and every advance was met with a fierce counterattack. "They're not giving up easily," one of my comrades yelled as we came under heavy fire. "We need to break through, or we'll be stuck here for hours." The battle reached its crescendo as we launched a final, desperate push to breach the heart of the stronghold. The fighting was savage and unrelenting, each inch gained through sheer force of will. We fought through the maze of bunkers and trenches, our movements synchronized by the urgent commands of our officers. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the battlefield, the resistance began to wane. The Soviet defenders, exhausted and overwhelmed, started to retreat. The final push had succeeded, and we had taken control of the stronghold. The victory was hard-earned, and the cost was evident in the strewn remnants of the battlefield. We stood amidst the wreckage, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as we surveyed the aftermath. The stronghold was a smoldering ruin, its defenses shattered and its fortifications breached. The once formidable complex was now a stark landscape of devastation, the echoes of battle still lingering in the air. The night fell with an oppressive weight, the darkness enveloping the battlefield in a somber shroud. The sounds of combat had faded, replaced by the quiet murmurs of exhausted soldiers and the distant cries of the wounded. The victory was ours, but it was a hollow one, marred by the heavy toll of the day's fighting. As I lay down amidst the rubble, my body aching from the exertion and my mind reeling from the day's events, I couldn't shake the sense of grim satisfaction. The offensive had been a brutal trial, a test of endurance and resolve. We had pushed through the Soviet stronghold, but the cost had been high. The stars began to emerge in the night sky, their distant twinkle a stark contrast to the harsh reality of the battlefield below. As I closed my eyes, the events of the day replayed in my mind, a relentless reminder of the harsh realities of war. The major offensive was over, but the path ahead was still fraught with uncertainty and peril.